July the 1st, 1916. The British Army walked into the single worst day in its entire history, and most of the men who died that day never even made it to the enemy trenches. This isn't about some strategic failure or bad luck. This is about a plan so flawed, so disconnected from reality, that it sent tens of thousands of men to their deaths in a matter of hours. The Battle of the Somme's first day is one of those moments in history where everything that could go wrong did go wrong, and the people in charge just kept sending more men into the meat grinder. We're going to walk through exactly what happened on that day, why it happened, and how the British Army managed to suffer nearly 60,000 casualties before the sun went down. Because understanding this one day helps you understand everything that was wrong with World War I. The Battle of the Somme was supposed to be the big breakthrough. After 2 years of trench warfare and stalemate, the British and French were planning a massive offensive that would smash through German lines and end the war. At least, that's what the generals promised. The plan was being developed in late 1915 and early 1916. Originally, it was supposed to be primarily a French operation with British support. The French would provide most of the troops, and the British would attack alongside them. But then, the Germans attacked Verdun in February 1916, and everything changed. Verdun became a meat grinder that sucked in French troops by the hundreds of thousands. The Germans were trying to bleed France white, forcing them to defend a position that had huge symbolic importance. The French couldn't abandon Verdun without a massive blow to national morale, so they had to keep feeding troops into the battle. The German strategy at Verdun was based on a calculation by General Erich von Falkenhayn. He figured that France would defend Verdun to the last man because of its historical and symbolic importance. Verdun had been a fortress city for centuries. It represented French strength and determination. Falkenhayn thought he could force France to commit all their reserves to defending Verdun, then kill so many French soldiers that France would have to surrender. This meant the Somme offensive had to change. The French couldn't provide as many troops anymore because they were all dying at Verdun, so the Somme became primarily a British operation. The goal shifted from breakthrough to relief. The British would attack to draw German troops away from Verdun and give the French some breathing room. The pressure on the British was enormous. The French were begging them to attack, to relieve the pressure on Verdun. The French had been Britain's ally for 2 years, had suffered terrible casualties, and now they needed help. The British felt obligated to attack. Even if the conditions weren't ideal, the British commander was General Douglas Haig, and he was convinced that this offensive would work. Haig believed in the power of artillery and the courage of British soldiers. He thought that if they just fired enough shells at the German positions, the Germans would be destroyed, and his men could walk across no man's land and occupy the trenches. Haig was a complicated figure. He was brave. He'd served with distinction in previous wars, and he genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. But he was also stubborn, resistant to new ideas, and completely out of touch with the reality of modern warfare. He'd been trained in an era when cavalry charges could win battles, and he never really adapted to the machine gun age. Haig was a cavalry officer by training. He'd spent his career learning about cavalry charges and mobile warfare. He didn't really understand the new technology of World War I. He still thought that at some point they'd break through the German lines, and cavalry would pour through the gap and win the war. This was 1916, and he was still thinking about cavalry charges. In fact, Haig had positioned cavalry units behind the lines, ready to exploit the breakthrough he was sure would happen. Thousands of horses and riders, waiting for their chance to charge through the German lines and restore mobile warfare. They would wait there all day on July 1st, and they would never be used because there would be no breakthrough. The plan was simple, maybe too simple. The British would bombard German positions for a week with every gun they had. This bombardment would destroy the German trenches, kill the defenders, and cut the barbed wire that protected their positions. Then, on the morning of July 1st, the infantry would advance across no man's land and occupy the destroyed German trenches. The simplicity of the plan was part of its appeal to Haig and his staff. They wanted something straightforward that wouldn't require complex coordination. They figured that overwhelming firepower would solve all problems. Just fire enough shells and victory would follow. It was industrial warfare reduced to its simplest form. More ammunition equals more success. The bombardment started on June 24, 1916. Over 1,500 British guns opened fire on German positions along a 15-mile front. They fired continuously for 7 days. Over 1.7 million shells were fired. That's more than 240,000 shells per day. The sound could be heard in London, over 100 miles away. The scale of this bombardment was unprecedented. It required months of preparation, stockpiling millions of shells, moving them to the front by train and truck, and distributing them to gun positions. The logistics were staggering. Britain's entire industrial capacity had been mobilized to produce this ammunition. Factories that used to make everything from cars to kitchen appliances were now making shells. British soldiers waiting in the trenches were confident. How could anything survive that? They'd been told the Germans would be destroyed, the trenches would be flattened, the barbed wire would be cut. All they had to do was walk across and occupy the positions. Some officers even told their men to walk slowly and stay in formation because there would be so little resistance. The soldiers wrote letters home describing what they were about to do. Many were excited, thinking this would be the battle that would end the war. They'd trained for months, some for over a year. They were ready. They trusted their officers and believed in the plan. The newspapers back home were full of optimistic stories about the upcoming offensive. The soldiers were loaded down with equipment. Each man was carrying about 60 to 70 pounds of gear: rifle, ammunition, grenades, entrenching tools, rations, water, wire cutters, sandbags. Some were carrying even more, like mortars or machine gun parts. The thinking was that once they captured the German trenches, they'd need supplies to hold them, so they should carry everything with them. The equipment list for an attacking soldier was absurd. Beyond his rifle and ammunition, he'd have 2 gas masks in case one was damaged. He'd have a steel helmet, which was relatively new and added several pounds. He'd have extra rations for 3 days, water bottles, grenades that weighed several pounds each, wire cutters, a shovel for digging, sandbags to build fortifications. If he was unlucky, he might also be carrying part of a machine gun or mortar or extra ammunition for those weapons. Trying to run while carrying 70 pounds of equipment is nearly impossible. Trying to climb out of a trench, cross rough ground full of shell holes, crawl through or over barbed wire, all while carrying that weight, would exhaust even the fittest soldier. And these men were expected to do all that while being shot at. But there were problems with the bombardment that nobody wanted to admit. First, about 30% of the shells were duds. They didn't explode. This was because Britain was producing ammunition so quickly that quality control suffered. Shells were being made by workers who'd never done this before, using processes that were rushed. So 1 out of every 3 shells just buried itself in the mud without exploding. The dud problem was known before the battle started. Artillery officers had been reporting high failure rates for months, but nobody wanted to delay the attack to fix the problem or to admit that the bombardment might not be as effective as claimed. So the reports were ignored, and the planning went forward based on the assumption that all shells would explode. These unexploded shells created another danger that would persist for years after the war. French and Belgian farmers are still finding unexploded World War I shells today, over 100 years later. People still die from these old shells. The Somme battlefield is still dangerous in places because of unexploded ammunition. Second, the Germans had built incredibly strong fortifications. Their trenches on the Somme weren't just ditches in the ground. They had deep dugouts, some of them 30 or 40 feet underground, reinforced with concrete and timber. These dugouts could survive almost anything except a direct hit from a heavy shell. The German positions on the Somme were some of the strongest on the entire Western Front. They'd been there since 1914, and they'd spent 2 years improving them. The dugouts had multiple entrances, ventilation systems, electric lighting in some cases. They were underground fortresses. The Germans would go down into these dugouts during bombardments and just wait it out. Some of the German dugouts were elaborate. They had multiple rooms, storage areas, medical stations, even kitchens. The larger ones could hold 100 men or more. They had bunk beds, tables, chairs. Some had wooden walls and floors. The Germans had essentially built underground barracks that were immune to artillery fire. The entrances to these dugouts were usually positioned on the backside of trenches, away from where shells were landing. They'd be reinforced with concrete or thick timber. Some had multiple entrances, so if one collapsed, men could still get in and out. The Germans had learned from 2 years of war how to build positions that could survive bombardment. Third, a lot of the artillery was firing shrapnel shells instead of high explosive. Shrapnel shells are great against troops in the open, but they're useless against fortifications. They'd explode in the air and spray metal balls downward, which was good for killing people but did nothing to destroy trenches or cut barbed wire. The British were using the wrong ammunition for the job. The reason for this was partly historical. Shrapnel shells had been effective in previous wars against troops advancing in the open. The British artillery had trained with shrapnel and had lots of it stockpiled. High explosive shells were newer, and there weren't as many available. So they used what they had, even though it wasn't the right tool for the job. Artillery officers knew shrapnel wasn't ideal for destroying trenches, but they were given quotas to meet. They had to fire a certain number of shells, and they used what was available. Nobody wanted to admit that they didn't have enough of the right kind of ammunition, because that would mean admitting the plan was flawed. And fourth, cutting barbed wire with artillery is really hard. You need to hit the wire directly with a heavy shell to destroy it. If you miss by even a few feet, the wire is still there. And the British had a lot of wire to cut. The Germans had set up massive belts of barbed wire in front of their trenches, some of them 30 or 40 yards deep. Cutting all of that would have required incredibly accurate fire, and artillery in 1916 just wasn't that accurate. Barbed wire in World War I wasn't like the wire you see on farms today. This was military wire, thicker and stronger, with bigger barbs. It was strung between wooden posts or metal stakes driven deep into the ground. The Germans would string it in multiple layers, creating an obstacle that was extremely difficult to cross even if you weren't being shot at. The wire would be placed in irregular patterns to make it harder to navigate. There would be gaps that looked like paths but were actually covered by machine guns. The Germans would repair and reinforce the wire constantly. By 1916, some sections had wire obstacles that were dozens of yards deep and several feet high. Artillery could destroy wire if the shells landed directly on it, but this required precision that didn't exist. Most shells would land near the wire and throw it around but not destroy it. Sometimes, the bombardment would actually make things worse, tangling the wire into even more chaotic barriers that were harder to cross. But the British commanders were confident. They'd fired 1.7 million shells. Surely that was enough. On the night of June 30th, the bombardment intensified. The guns fired even faster, trying to destroy anything that was left. British soldiers prepared to go over the top at 7:30 a.m. on July 1st. The evening before the attack, soldiers prepared their equipment and wrote final letters home. Many suspected they wouldn't survive, but they kept that to themselves. Officers checked and rechecked their plans. Everyone tried to get some sleep, though the constant noise of artillery made that nearly impossible. Some soldiers prayed, some joked nervously with their friends. Some sat silently, lost in their own thoughts. Officers gave speeches about duty and courage. Chaplains held services and offered communion. Everyone dealt with the stress in their own way. The plan was for the infantry to advance in waves. The first wave would leave the trenches and walk toward German lines. Once they'd advanced a certain distance, the second wave would follow, then the third, and so on. The idea was to have a continuous stream of men moving forward, overwhelming any resistance. Each wave would consist of several lines of men spaced out at intervals. The thinking was that if the first line was hit by artillery or machine gun fire, the lines behind would keep advancing. It was a numbers game. Send enough men forward, and some would get through. The waves were supposed to be coordinated across the entire front. Everyone would advance at the same time, putting pressure on the Germans everywhere simultaneously. This would prevent the Germans from concentrating their fire on any one sector. At least that was the theory. The soldiers were told to advance in straight lines, keeping pace with each other. They were not supposed to run. Walking was considered more orderly and would allow officers to maintain control. Running was seen as undisciplined. The officers genuinely believed there would be so little resistance that maintaining formation was more important than speed. This decision to walk instead of run has been debated by historians ever since. Some argue it was necessary to maintain unit cohesion and prevent chaos. Others say it was a death sentence that turned soldiers into easy targets. What's clear is that many soldiers died because they were following orders to walk slowly when running might have saved them. The reasoning behind the walking order was based on the assumption that the bombardment had worked. If the Germans were all dead or hiding, there was no need to rush. Walking would keep the formation together and make it easier for officers to maintain control. It would also conserve energy for when soldiers reached the German trenches and had to fight. But this reasoning was completely wrong because it was based on faulty assumptions. The Germans weren't dead. They were waiting in their dugouts, ready to emerge as soon as the bombardment stopped. Walking slowly just gave them more time to set up their machine guns and more targets to shoot at. At 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, 1916, whistles blew along the British line. Officers climbed up ladders out of the trenches. Men followed them, and they started walking toward the German lines. The whistle was the signal. Thousands of men heard it at the same time and began climbing out of the trenches. It was difficult just getting out. The trenches were deep, the ladders were narrow, and men were carrying heavy loads. They'd climb up, step onto the ground above, and start walking forward. Some units had cut gaps in their own barbed wire to create paths. Men would funnel through these gaps, creating bottlenecks where they were bunched together. Other units had to climb over or through their own wire, which slowed them down and exhausted them before they'd even started crossing no man's land. The Germans had known the attack was coming. You can't fire 1.7 million shells without the enemy noticing. When the bombardment stopped, German soldiers knew exactly what that meant. Attack incoming. They climbed out of their deep dugouts, set up their machine guns, and waited. The sudden silence when the bombardment stopped was almost shocking. For 7 days, the noise had been constant. Then it stopped, and for a few moments there was relative quiet. That's when the Germans knew they'd been trained on what to do. Grab your weapon, climb up the stairs from the dugout, get to your position, and prepare to fire. German machine gunners would set up their weapons on the firing step of the trench, or in specially prepared positions that gave them a clear field of fire across no man's land. They'd load belt after belt of ammunition. They'd adjust their sights, and they'd wait for targets to appear. As the British soldiers came into view, walking in straight lines across no man's land, the Germans opened fire. Machine guns fired from multiple positions. Rifles added to the fire. Artillery started dropping shells on no man's land. The British soldiers started falling. The machine gun fire was devastating. Each gun could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. The Germans would aim at the advancing lines of soldiers and just sweep back and forth. Men would drop in rows. Sometimes entire lines cut down in seconds. The soldiers behind would keep coming, stepping over the bodies of their friends, and they'd be shot down too. In some sectors, entire battalions were wiped out in minutes. Men would climb out of their trenches and immediately get hit. Those who made it a few yards would get caught in the barbed wire that hadn't been cut and get shot while trying to free themselves. Those who made it past the wire would get cut down by machine gun fire before reaching the German trenches. The barbed wire problem was worse than anyone had anticipated. In many sectors, the wire was barely damaged. British soldiers would reach it and realize they couldn't get through. They'd try to find gaps, crawling along the wire looking for a way forward, but there were no gaps. The Germans had positioned machine guns to cover the wire obstacles, knowing that attackers would be helpless when they got stuck. Soldiers caught in the wire made perfect targets. They couldn't move forward or back quickly. They'd struggle with the wire, getting more tangled. Some would just hang there, dead or wounded, caught in the wire. Others would try to use their wire cutters, but cutting through military-grade barbed wire takes time, and they didn't have time. The Newfoundland Regiment provides one of the saddest examples. They went over the top at Beaumont Hamel and advanced toward the German lines. Within 30 minutes, the regiment had been destroyed. Out of about 800 men who attacked, only 68 answered roll call the next day. The rest were dead or wounded. 90% casualties in half an hour. The Newfoundland Regiment's story is particularly tragic because they weren't even supposed to be in the first wave. They were reserves. But the initial attacks had failed so badly that they were ordered forward to try again. They advanced across ground that was already covered with bodies from earlier waves. They could see what had happened to the units before them, but they went forward anyway because those were their orders. The regiment advanced across 250 yards of open ground. German machine guns fired on them from 3 sides. There was nowhere to take cover. Some men tried to hide in shell craters, but the German gunners knew where these craters were and fired at them. The regiment was essentially annihilated in the time it takes to eat breakfast. Back in Newfoundland, almost every family knew someone in the regiment. When news of the casualties reached home, it devastated the entire island. July 1st is still commemorated in Newfoundland today as Memorial Day, a day to remember the soldiers who died on the Somme. The problem was that nothing had gone according to plan. The German trenches weren't destroyed. The dugouts had protected the defenders. When the bombardment stopped, they climbed up, set up their weapons, and they were ready. The barbed wire hadn't been cut in most places. British soldiers got tangled in the wire and became easy targets, and the Germans had plenty of machine guns and ammunition. One German soldier later wrote about what he saw. He said the British soldiers were walking toward him in straight lines, as if they were on parade. He couldn't believe it. He and his fellow machine gunners just kept firing. He said it felt like murder, not combat. The British soldiers had no chance. This German soldier, whose account was published after the war, said he felt sick at what he was doing. But he kept firing because if he didn't, the British would reach his position and kill him and his friends. He described the British advance as brave, but pointless. He couldn't understand why they were walking instead of running, or why they kept coming wave after wave when it was obviously hopeless. German soldiers were shocked by British tactics. They'd expected a fierce attack with soldiers rushing forward, taking cover, using fire and movement. Instead, they saw lines of men walking slowly across open ground. Some Germans thought it was a trick, that the real attack would come from somewhere else. Others thought the British were crazy, but they kept firing because that was their job. Some units did manage to reach the German trenches. These were usually places where the bombardment had actually worked, where the Germans were fewer in number, or where British soldiers had gotten across no man's land quickly despite orders, but these units found themselves isolated. They'd captured a section of trench, but units on either side had failed to advance, so they were surrounded. The problem with capturing an isolated section of trench is that you can be attacked from multiple directions. The Germans would counterattack, bringing troops from nearby positions that hadn't been attacked. The British soldiers who'd made it to the German trenches would find themselves fighting desperately against reinforcements, often running out of ammunition, and eventually being killed or captured. At Thiepval, Some British troops actually made it into the German positions. They fought hand-to-hand in the trenches, using bayonets, clubs, grenades, whatever they had, but they couldn't hold. German reinforcements came up through the underground tunnels and dugouts. The British were pushed back, and most of them didn't make it back to their own lines. The fighting in captured trenches was brutal and chaotic. These were confined spaces where men fought at close range. Grenades would be thrown around corners. Men would shoot at each other from a few feet away. Bayonets, clubs, even fists were used. It was savage, personal combat that left survivors traumatized. The British soldiers who'd captured a section of trench would try to consolidate their position, setting up defenses facing both directions because Germans could attack from either side. They'd send runners back to their own lines asking for reinforcements and ammunition. But often, these runners would be killed crossing no man's land, and the message never arrived. Without reinforcements, these isolated groups would eventually be overwhelmed. German counterattacks would come from multiple directions. The British would run out of ammunition and have to fight with whatever they could find. Some groups fought until they were all killed. Others surrendered when they realized the situation was hopeless. Back at British headquarters, the commanders didn't really understand what was happening. Communications in World War I were terrible. Telephone lines would get cut by artillery. Runners would get killed trying to carry messages. Radio technology was primitive and unreliable. So, headquarters would send troops forward without really knowing if the previous waves had succeeded or failed. The communication problem was one of the fundamental challenges of World War I. Commanders needed to know what was happening at the front so they could make decisions, but getting accurate information was almost impossible. By the time a report reached headquarters, the situation had usually changed. Telephone lines ran from headquarters to the front trenches, but they were vulnerable. Artillery would cut the lines, and repair teams would have to go out under fire to fix them. Sometimes the same line would be cut in multiple places. Wireless radio existed, but was bulky and unreliable. It required large equipment and trained operators, and the range was limited. This meant that even after it became clear the attack was failing in some sectors, more men were still being sent forward. Officers in the rear were looking at maps and making decisions based on outdated information. They'd think a unit had captured a position when actually that unit had been wiped out hours earlier. So they'd send reinforcements to support an advance that hadn't happened, and those reinforcements would get slaughtered too. The system of sending reserves forward was rigid and pre-planned. Certain units were designated as reserves and told they'd advance at specific times to support the initial attack. These units would follow their schedule even if the situation had changed. They'd advance because that's what the plan said, not because it made sense given current conditions. Some junior officers on the front lines tried to stop the attacks. They could see what was happening. They knew their men were being killed for nothing. But orders were orders. If headquarters said advance, you advanced. Some officers refused and were court-martialed later. Others obeyed and led their men to their deaths. There are accounts of junior officers arguing with their superiors, begging them not to send more men forward. These officers had seen the previous attacks fail, and they'd seen the casualties. They knew that sending more men would just add to the body count. But the military hierarchy was strict. Questioning orders was insubordination. The attacks continued. Some officers who refused orders were arrested on the spot. Others led the attacks themselves, knowing they were pointless because they felt it was their duty to be with their men. Some of these officers were killed leading attacks they knew were hopeless. Their courage was real, but it was wasted on a plan that never should have been executed. The generals behind the lines kept sending men forward for most of the day. It wasn't until late afternoon that the scale of the disaster became clear. Even then, some sectors kept attacking into the evening. The last attacks of the day were just as pointless as the first. Men climbing out of trenches and getting shot before they made it 20 yards. The delay in recognizing the failure was partly due to optimism and denial. Haig and his staff wanted the plan to work so badly that they interpreted every piece of information in the most positive way possible. A report that a unit had reached German trenches would be taken as success, even if that unit was later wiped out. Any small gain would be seen as progress that could be exploited. There was also the sunk cost fallacy at work. So many men had already been committed, so much ammunition expended that stopping felt like admitting defeat. The thinking was that they'd come this far, they had to keep going. One more push might achieve the breakthrough. This thinking led to more attacks and more casualties throughout the day. By nightfall on July 1st, the British had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, about 19,240 dead, and the rest wounded or missing. It was the single worst day in British military history. Some battalions had been completely destroyed. Some villages in Britain would lose almost every young man of fighting age. Entire communities devastated in a single day. To put that in perspective, Britain suffered more casualties on the first day of the Somme than the United States suffered during the entire Vietnam War. in one day. The scale of the loss is hard to comprehend. Imagine a stadium filled with 60,000 people. Now imagine every single one of them being killed or wounded in the span of 12 hours. That's what happened on July 1st, 1916. The casualty lists took days to compile. As information trickled back from the front, the numbers kept growing. At first, headquarters thought they'd lost a few thousand men. Then it was 10,000. Then 20,000. The final count of nearly 60,000 was shocking even to the generals who'd planned the offensive. And what had been gained? Almost nothing. In most sectors, the British hadn't advanced at all. In a few places, they'd captured some German trenches, but these gains were tiny compared to the casualties. The big breakthrough that was supposed to happen didn't happen. The German line held. The territorial gains were measured in yards in most places. Some sectors advanced a few hundred yards. Others didn't move at all. The deepest penetration was about a mile, in areas where the attack had been more successful. But these were isolated gains that couldn't be exploited. Overall, the British had achieved almost nothing for their terrible losses. So what went wrong? Pretty much everything. The artillery bombardment failed to destroy the German defenses. The barbed wire wasn't cut. And the Germans weren't killed, they were just hiding in their dugouts. The British tactics were suicidal, walking in straight lines toward machine guns. The equipment the soldiers were carrying was too heavy and slowed them down. Communications were so bad the commanders didn't know what was happening. And the generals kept sending men forward even after it was clear the attacks were failing. Each of these failures was bad enough on its own. Combined, they created a perfect storm of disaster. The amazing thing is that so many things went wrong, but nobody stopped the attack. The rigid military planning and hierarchy meant that once the operation started, it continued regardless of circumstances. There's also the question of why the British tactics were so bad. Why did they insist on walking instead of running? Why did they advance in straight lines? Why were soldiers carrying so much equipment? Part of it was the Army's belief in discipline and order. The British Army had a long tradition of maintaining formation and following orders precisely. This had worked in previous wars where battles were more open and fluid. But it didn't work in World War I, where machine guns could kill hundreds of men in minutes. The British military culture valued conformity and obedience above initiative and adaptability. Officers were trained to follow doctrine, not to improvise. Soldiers were trained to obey without question. This created an army that was good at following plans but terrible at adapting when plans failed. Part of it was also classism. The British Army in 1916 was mostly made up of volunteers, the so-called PALS battalions. These were men who'd volunteered together from the same towns or workplaces. They weren't professional soldiers. The officers didn't entirely trust them to use initiative or adapt to changing circumstances, so they gave them simple orders. Walk forward in a line. Don't run. Maintain formation. They treated these men like they needed to be controlled rather than like soldiers who could think for themselves. The PALS battalions were a unique feature of the British Army in World War I. When war broke out in 1914, hundreds of thousands of men volunteered. The Army encouraged men from the same communities to join together, promising they'd serve in the same units. This was supposed to boost morale and make recruitment easier. So you had battalions made up, entirely of men from specific towns or industries. There were battalions of miners, factory workers, clerks, footballers. These men knew each other before the war. They'd trained together, lived together, and now they were fighting together. The idea was that this shared identity would make them better soldiers, but it also meant that when a PALS battalion was wiped out, entire communities lost all their young men at once. Towns in northern England would have hundreds of families receive telegrams on the same day, all saying their sons had been killed or wounded. The Somme destroyed entire PALS battalions and devastated the communities they came from. And part of it was just incompetence at the highest levels. Generals like Haig were out of touch with the reality of trench warfare. They made plans based on what they wanted to happen rather than what was likely to happen. They ignored warnings from junior officers who actually understood what combat was like. They were so convinced their plan would work that they didn't prepare for failure. Haig had been told by some junior officers that the plan was flawed. Reports had come in saying the wire wasn't cut, the German positions looked intact, the bombardment hadn't been effective. But Haig dismissed these concerns. He believed in his plan and in the power of British firepower and British courage. There's a theory that generals like Haig had spent so long planning the offensive, had invested so much prestige in it, that they couldn't admit it might fail. Calling off the attack would have meant admitting they'd been wrong. So they pushed forward, hoping that determination and willpower would overcome reality. The first day of the Somme is one of those events where you can see everything that was wrong with World War I in one place. The disconnect between generals and frontline soldiers, the failure to adapt to new technology, the willingness to accept massive casualties for minimal gains, the way the war turned men into statistics. But here's the thing that makes it even worse. The Battle of the Somme didn't end on July 1st. It kept going for another 4.5 months. The British kept attacking, using the same tactics that had failed on the first day. The casualties kept mounting. By the time the battle ended in November 1916, the British had suffered over 400,000 casualties. The French had another 200,000. The Germans lost around 500,000. The battle continued through July, August, September, October, and into November. Every day there were attacks. Every day more men died. The tactics did gradually improve. The British learned to use creeping barrages where artillery fire would move forward just ahead of advancing infantry. They learned to attack on narrower fronts with more concentrated force. But the learning process was slow and paid for in blood. And what did all those casualties achieve? The Allies advanced about 6 miles. 6 miles in 4.5 months. That's about 1 mile per month. At a cost of over 1 million casualties total. The German line didn't break. There was no breakthrough. The war continued for another 2 years. 6 miles. You can walk 6 miles in about 2 hours. The Allies took 4.5 months and 1 million casualties to advance that far. When you visit the Somme battlefield today, you can drive from the British starting positions to the furthest point of advance in about 10 minutes. That's what 1 million casualties bought. Haig and the other generals defended the Somme offensive. They said it was necessary to relieve pressure on Verdun, which was true. They said it wore down German strength, which was also somewhat true, but they couldn't escape the fact that the first day had been a complete disaster that never should have happened. The PALS battalions were destroyed on the Somme. These battalions, made up of men from the same communities, meant that when a battalion was wiped out, entire towns lost their young men all at once. There are towns in northern England where almost every family lost someone on the Somme. The memorials in these towns list dozens of names from the same day. It devastated communities in a way that's hard to imagine. Small towns and villages across Britain and the British Empire were hit incredibly hard. In some places, nearly every man between 18 and 40 was dead or wounded. The economic and social impact was enormous. Farms had no one to work them. Businesses closed because there were no workers. Women were suddenly widows. Children were orphans. Parents had lost their sons. The memorials you see in British villages today often list more names from World War I than from any other conflict, including World War II. And many of those World War I names are all from the same date, July 1st, 1916. Walking through these villages and seeing the memorials is deeply moving. You realize that this wasn't just a military disaster, it was a human catastrophe that affected every level of society. The survivors of the first day were traumatized. They'd watched their friends die for nothing. They'd seen the incompetence of their commanders firsthand. Many of them never talked about what they'd experienced. They couldn't find words to describe the horror of walking toward machine guns, watching men fall all around them, knowing they were going to die and being unable to do anything about it. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't recognized as a medical condition until long after World War I. Men who came back from the Somme with psychological wounds were often dismissed as cowards or malingerers. They'd have nightmares, flashbacks, anxiety attacks. Some couldn't hold jobs or maintain relationships. Some turned to alcohol to cope. Some committed suicide years after the war ended. The psychological cost of the Somme can't be measured just in casualty figures. Thousands of men survived physically, but were broken mentally. They'd carry the trauma for the rest of their lives, and they'd pass that trauma on to their families, creating ripples that lasted for generations. The first day of the Somme changed British society. Before the Somme, there was still some romantic notion about war, about glory and heroism. After the Somme, people understood that modern war was just industrial-scale slaughter. The poets and writers who came out of World War I wrote about the Somme with bitterness and anger. They felt betrayed by the older generation that had sent them to die. The cultural shift was profound. Before 1916, war was often portrayed in heroic terms. Newspapers ran stories about brave soldiers and glorious victories. Recruitment posters showed strong, proud men defending their homeland. The reality of trench warfare was hidden from the public or sugar-coated. After the Somme, that changed. Too many families had lost sons, brothers, fathers. Too many wounded men had come home with horrific injuries. Too many survivors told stories about the incompetence and waste. The public started questioning the war and the generals running it. Trust in authority declined. The idea that war was noble and glorious died in the mud of the Somme. The phrase, lions led by donkeys, comes from World War I. The idea that brave soldiers, the lions, were being led by incompetent commanders, the donkeys. The first day of the Somme is the perfect example of this. brave men following orders, walking into machine gun fire because they were told to, while the generals who gave those orders were safely behind the lines. This phrase captured the anger that soldiers and their families felt toward the high command. The soldiers had done everything asked of them. They'd trained, they'd followed orders, they'd shown courage under impossible conditions, and they'd been betrayed by poor planning and stubborn leadership that refused to adapt when the plan failed. The relationship between officers and enlisted men was complicated. Junior officers, lieutenants, and captains who actually led men into battle were often respected and even loved by their troops. These officers shared the dangers and hardships. Many of them died alongside their men, but the senior officers, the generals and colonels who planned operations from headquarters miles behind the lines, were often despised. Military historians still study the first day of the Somme as an example of what not to do: the failure to adapt tactics to new technology, the failure to properly prepare, the failure to call off attacks that were obviously failing, the failure to learn from mistakes. It's a case study in military incompetence. Military academies around the world use the Somme as a teaching tool. What were the mistakes? How could they have been avoided? What should have been done differently? The answers seem obvious in hindsight. Better reconnaissance, more realistic planning, flexible tactics, willingness to call off failed attacks, better communication between headquarters and the front line. But studying the Somme also reveals how difficult command decisions are in war. Haig was under enormous political pressure to attack. The French were desperate for relief at Verdun. The British public expected victory. Calling off the offensive would have been politically difficult. This doesn't excuse the failures, but it helps explain them. But it's also important to remember the men who died that day. They weren't statistics, they were people. Farmers, factory workers, teachers, clerks. They'd volunteered because they thought they were defending their country. They'd trained together, lived together, and on July 1st, 1916, they died together. Each of those 60,000 casualties was an individual with a life story. They had families who loved them. They had dreams and plans for the future. They had personalities, quirks, things that made them laugh, things they worried about. Reducing them to numbers on a casualty list, to statistics and a historical analysis, erases their humanity. Read the letters these men wrote before the battle. They're heartbreaking. Some are optimistic, confident they'll be home soon. Others are more realistic, saying goodbye just in case. Some make jokes, trying to keep things light. Others are deeply emotional, expressing love for family and gratitude for their lives. These letters remind us that behind every casualty figure is a real person who mattered to someone. There's a memorial at Thiepval in France that lists the names of 72,000 British and South African soldiers who died on the Somme and have no known grave. Their bodies were never recovered or never identified. 72,000 names carved into stone. Walking through that memorial is overwhelming. Each name represents a person who had a family, had dreams, had a life that was cut short. The Thiepval Memorial is one of the most moving war memorials in the world. It's massive, over 140 feet tall, with names covering every surface. The sheer number of names is staggering. You can spend hours walking around it and not read every name. And these are just the ones with no known grave. There are dozens of other cemeteries in the area for soldiers whose bodies were found. Visitors to Thiepval often describe feeling overwhelmed by emotion. You look at the names and try to comprehend the scale of the loss, and it's almost impossible. Then you focus on individual names and think about the person behind that name. Who was he? What was he like? What would he have done with his life if he'd survived? These questions have no answers, but you can't help asking them. The memorial is also a reminder of the randomness of death in war. Some men's bodies were found and buried with grave markers. Others disappeared entirely, blown apart by shells, or buried so deep in the mud they could never be recovered. Whether a family got to bury their son, or just see his name on a memorial, often came down to pure chance. The Battle of the Somme, and especially the first day, shows what happens when military planning fails to keep up with military technology. The generals were fighting the previous war, using tactics from the 1800s against weapons from the 1900s, and the soldiers paid the price. This technological gap was the fundamental problem. Machine guns had changed warfare, but tactics hadn't changed to account for them. Artillery had become far more powerful, but no one had figured out how to use it effectively against deep fortifications. Barbed wire could stop infantry advances, but there was no reliable way to clear it. The weapons had evolved faster than the thinking. The tragedy is that by 1918, the British had largely figured out how to fight this kind of war. They'd developed tactics that worked, but it took years of trial and error, and the errors cost hundreds of thousands of lives. The men who died on July 1st, 1916 were victims of a learning process that should have happened before the war started, not during it. It also shows the human cost of war. 60,000 casualties in one day. Each one of those was a person, someone's son, brother, father, husband, someone who woke up that morning, checked their equipment, climbed a ladder out of a trench, and walked toward the enemy because that's what they were ordered to do. Most of them knew they probably wouldn't survive. They did it anyway. This courage deserves recognition, even as we acknowledge the futility of how it was spent. These men were asked to do something almost impossible, and many of them did it without hesitation. That says something about human nature, about duty and loyalty and the bonds between soldiers. It's tragic that such courage was wasted, but the courage itself was real. Think about what it takes to climb out of a trench when you can hear machine guns firing, when you can see men being killed in front of you, and walk forward anyway. That requires a level of courage that most of us will never have to demonstrate. These men deserve to be remembered not just as victims of bad planning, but as individuals who faced death with bravery. The first day of the Somme stands as one of the darkest days in military history, not because of the number of casualties alone, though that's staggering, but because it was so preventable. Better tactics, better preparation, better leadership could have saved thousands of lives. Instead, brave men were wasted in attacks that had no chance of success. Every military disaster has lessons to teach. The Somme teaches that courage alone isn't enough, that firepower alone isn't enough, that determination alone isn't enough. You need smart planning, flexible tactics, honest assessment of what's working and what isn't. You need leaders who are willing to adapt and who care more about winning than about their own egos. The Somme also teaches that there's a human cost to every military decision. When generals move pins on a map, they're sending real people to kill and be killed. Those decisions should never be made lightly. The casualties on July 1st weren't just numbers on a report. They were people who mattered, and their loss diminished everyone. The legacy of the Somme lived on. The British Army eventually learned from their mistakes and developed better tactics. By 1918, they were using combined arms warfare effectively. But it took hundreds of thousands of casualties and years of trial and error to get there. The men who died on July 1st, 1916 were the ones who paid for that education. The improvements that came after the Somme were significant. The British developed creeping barrages where artillery fire moved forward just ahead of infantry. They learned to concentrate attacks on narrow fronts rather than spreading out across miles. They learned to use tanks and aircraft to support infantry. They learned to infiltrate rather than advance in rigid lines. All of these lessons were learned through experience, through trial and error on the battlefield. Each improvement was paid for in casualties. By late 1918, the British were arguably the most effective army on the Western Front, with tactics that worked. But getting to that point required the sacrifice of hundreds of thousands of men. The question that haunts historians is whether this learning process could have been accelerated. Could the British have figured out effective tactics earlier? Could they have avoided some of the disasters? The answer is probably yes if leadership had been more flexible, more willing to learn from mistakes, more willing to listen to junior officers who understood combat conditions. Today, the battlefields of the Somme are peaceful. Farms and forests have grown back, but there are cemeteries everywhere, rows and rows of white headstones, each one marking a soldier who died in that battle. Visitors walk through these cemeteries and see the dates. July 1st, 1916 appears over and over again. Sometimes you'll see a dozen graves in a row, all from the same day, all from the same unit. Men who went over the top together and died together. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains these cemeteries impeccably. The grass is always cut, the headstones are clean, flowers are planted. It's peaceful and beautiful, which makes it even more sad. These young men should be old men now, surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Instead, they're here, forever young, forever silent. Walking through these cemeteries, you notice patterns. Clusters of graves from the same unit, all with the same date. You realize these were friends, men who knew each other, who died within minutes of each other. You see ages on the headstones, 19, 20, 22, 18, so young. Their lives barely started before they ended. Some graves have personal inscriptions added by families. A beloved son, gone but not forgotten, until we meet again. These inscriptions are heartbreaking because they show the personal grief behind the military casualty. Someone loved this person. Someone's world ended when they died. These weren't just soldiers, they were somebody's everything. The story of the first day of the Somme is a story of courage and tragedy. Courage from the men who faced almost certain death and advanced anyway. Tragedy because their courage was wasted by commanders who didn't understand the war they were fighting. It's a reminder of the human cost of military incompetence and the price paid by ordinary people for the mistakes of those in power. This story needs to be told and retold, not to glorify war or to wallow in tragedy, but to remember, to honor the men who died, to learn from the mistakes that killed them, to understand what happens when leadership fails and technology changes faster than thinking, to recognize that behind every statistic is a human being who mattered. The first day of the Somme is also a reminder to question authority, especially military authority. The soldiers who died that day trusted their leaders. They believed the plan would work. They followed orders even when those orders seemed wrong. And they died because the people they trusted had made terrible mistakes. This doesn't mean soldiers should disobey orders or that military discipline isn't important, but it does mean that leaders have a responsibility to be competent, to be honest about risks and chances of success, to care more about their soldiers' lives than about their own reputations. The generals at the Somme failed this responsibility, and tens of thousands of men paid the price. The families of the men who died at the Somme carried that grief for the rest of their lives. Mothers who lost sons, wives who lost husbands, children who grew up without fathers, siblings who lost brothers. The pain didn't end on July 1st. It continued for decades, affecting multiple generations. Many families never got closure. If their loved one had no known grave, they had no place to visit, no grave to tend. They'd receive a telegram saying their son or husband was missing, presumed dead, and that would be it. No body to bury, no funeral, just an absence and uncertainty that never went away. Even families who got to bury their loved ones struggled. The grief was compounded by the knowledge that the death had been largely pointless. If these men had died in a successful attack that helped win the war, maybe there would have been some comfort in that. But they died in a failed attack that achieved nothing. Their sacrifice hadn't even contributed to victory. The Somme changed how Britain thought about war and sacrifice. Before, there was a sense that dying for your country was noble and meaningful. After the Somme, many people questioned whether any war could be worth this cost. The generation that survived World War I was determined to prevent another war, but they failed. World War II came just 21 years later, but the memory of the Somme did influence how World War II was fought. British commanders in World War II were more cautious about casualties. They remembered the Somme and were determined not to repeat those mistakes. This sometimes made them too cautious, too reluctant to take risks, but it came from a genuine desire not to waste lives the way they'd been wasted at the Somme. The soldiers who survived the Somme and went on to become commanders in World War II brought those lessons with them. They knew what bad leadership looked like. They knew the cost of poor planning and inflexibility. They tried to do better, and often they succeeded. World War II was still terrible, but British casualties were generally lower relative to the objectives achieved, partly because commanders had learned from World War I. The first day of the Somme remains relevant today because the fundamental issues it raises are timeless. How do you balance the need to achieve military objectives with the responsibility to preserve soldiers' lives? How do you know when to persist with a plan and when to adapt? How do you ensure that leaders are competent and that mistakes are learned from quickly rather than repeated? These questions don't have easy answers. War is chaotic and unpredictable. Mistakes happen. But the Somme shows what happens when mistakes are allowed to continue unchecked, when leaders are too proud or stubborn to admit failure, when the lives of soldiers are treated as expendable resources rather than as precious and irreplaceable. Modern militaries study the Somme and claim they've learned from it. They talk about mission-type orders that give flexibility to commanders on the ground. They talk about the importance of good intelligence and realistic planning. They talk about the need to adapt quickly when plans fail. These are all lessons from the Somme. Whether they're actually applied in practice is another question. Every war has its Somme, its days when everything goes wrong and people die unnecessarily because of poor planning or bad leadership. Technology changes, tactics change, but human nature doesn't. The same mistakes keep getting made because the same human flaws, pride, stubbornness, disconnection from reality, inability to admit error, keep appearing. The best way to honor the men who died on July 1st, 1916, is to remember them and to learn from what killed them. To never forget that war has a human cost. To recognize that courage and sacrifice, while admirable, aren't enough if they're directed by incompetence. To demand better from leaders, military and civilian, who send young people to fight. The Somme is also a reminder that individuals matter. In a battle with 60,000 casualties, it's easy to lose sight of the individual stories. But each of those casualties was a unique person. They had different personalities, different backgrounds, different reasons for being there. Some were eager for combat, others were terrified, Some were natural soldiers. Others had never imagined they'd be in uniform. Historians' accounts often focus on generals, on grand strategy, on the big picture. But the real story of the Somme is in the individual experiences. The soldier waiting in the trench as 0 hour approached, the officer blowing his whistle and climbing the ladder, the machine gunner who couldn't believe what he was seeing, the wounded man lying in no man's land, calling for help that wouldn't come. These individual moments of terror, pain, courage, and death are what the Somme was really about. If you ever get the chance to visit the Somme battlefield, take it. Walk the ground where the attack happened. Stand in the preserved trenches. Look across no man's land and try to imagine walking across it under fire. Visit the cemeteries and memorials. Read the names. Take time to absorb what happened there. It's one thing to read about 60,000 casualties in a book. It's another thing entirely to stand on the ground where it happened and try to comprehend the reality of it. The Somme landscape is deceptive. It's gently rolling farmland, peaceful and pretty. It's hard to imagine the hell that existed there in 1916. But the cemeteries are everywhere, constant reminders. And if you look closely, you can still see traces of the war. Shell craters, though softened by a century of erosion. Lines in the ground where trenches once ran. Patches of disturbed earth where something is buried. Local farmers still find ammunition and human remains when they plow their fields. After a century, the land still gives up the artifacts of that battle. Shells, grenades, bones. These discoveries are reminders that the Somme isn't ancient history. It's recent enough that physical evidence remains, recent enough that it's still part of the landscape. The people who live in the Somme region have a complicated relationship with the battle. It's part of their history and identity. The war memorials and cemeteries bring tourism, which helps the local economy. But it's also a burden, being known primarily for a military disaster that happened over a century ago. They want to be remembered for more than just the battle, but the battle overshadows everything else. The first day of the Somme matters because it was a turning point. It was the day British society lost its innocence about war. It was the day the volunteers of 1914, who'd signed up with enthusiasm, learned what industrial warfare really meant. It was the day the gap between military leadership and military reality became impossible to ignore. After July 1st, nothing was the same. The war continued for another 2 years, but something fundamental had changed. People stopped believing the generals who promised victory. Soldiers stopped believing their officers who said the next attack would work. The trust and optimism that had carried Britain through the first 2 years of war died on the Somme. This loss of trust had consequences that lasted long after the war ended. When World War II came, British society was more cynical, more questioning of authority. This was partly because of the Somme, because an entire generation had learned that leaders could be wrong, that promises could be empty, that sacrifice didn't guarantee success. The story of the first day of the Somme is ultimately a story about the gap between intention and reality, between planning and execution, between what leaders promise and what actually happens. Haig and his generals intended to break through German lines and win the war. They promised their soldiers that the bombardment would destroy German defenses. They planned for a quick victory. And reality crushed all of those intentions, promises, and plans. This gap exists in all human endeavors, but in war, it kills people. On July 1st, 1916, the gap between what was supposed to happen and what actually happened killed nearly 20,000 men and wounded 40,000 more. That's the real lesson of the Somme. Good intentions aren't enough. Careful planning isn't enough. Courage isn't enough. You need realism, flexibility, and humility to admit when you're wrong. The men who died on the first day of the Somme deserved better. They deserved better planning, better leadership, better tactics. They deserved to have their courage and sacrifice used wisely rather than wasted. They deserved to survive and go home to their families. Instead, they died in a failed attack that achieved nothing, and their deaths were largely pointless. But their memory isn't pointless. Remembering them, telling their story, learning from what happened to them. That gives their deaths meaning. Not the meaning they should have had, not the glory of dying in a successful cause, but the meaning of being a warning, a reminder, a lesson. The first day of the Somme teaches us that war is terrible, that leadership matters, that courage alone isn't enough, and that every casualty is a human tragedy. Watch the next video.